welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1953 film From Here to Eternity. Film focuses on the activities, lives, and misadventures of several career U.S. Army soldiers based on Oahu's Schofield Barracks in the days leading up to and shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. From Here to Eternity stars Montgomery Clift as Pruitt, Burt Lancaster as Sergeant Warden, Deborah Kerr, Donna Reed, Ernest Borgnine, and Old Blue Eyes Frank Sinatra as Maggio. From Here to Eternity was directed by Fred Zinnemann, produced by Buddy Adler, and based on the book of the same name written by James Jones. From Here to Eternity was a massive financial and critical success. Film was nominated for 12 Academy Awards, winning 8, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actress for Donna Reed, and Best Supporting Actor for Sinatra.
So, as far as I was concerned, we were helpless. We had no ways of defending our island if the Japanese had followed up with an invasion.
It's difficult to describe From Here to Eternity as a movie about Pearl Harbor because it's not. It's a movie that is about Army life on Oahu before and shortly after Pearl Harbor. As we said in the main episode, the attack on Pearl Harbor, or in this case what should actually be called the attack on Oahu, is depicted in the final 15 to 20 minutes of the film. And it's depicted very well too, in my opinion. The confusion and chaos that was the Japanese air raid is shown well from the Army perspective, one not usually seen in movies about the attack. While the U.S. Navy garners the majority of the attention from historians in regards to Pearl Harbor, for obvious reasons, the Army and their experiences should not be left out. As unprepared for an enemy attack as the Navy was, the Army was too. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Army officials determined that if an attack was to come against U.S. forces in Hawaii, it would more than likely come from what was then called a fifth column, saboteurs. General Walter Short had issued the sabotage order, or anti-sabotage order really, to protect the bombers and fighters scattered across the island. It was not unknown to the Army that tens of thousands of Japanese lived on Oahu. Many of them worked near or on bases like Hickam, Wheeler Field, and other Army installations. These civilians were thought by the Army to be the most likely of Japanese combatants, not a naval air strike force. It was this sort of paranoia that would infest American thinking in the days after Pearl Harbor, and it's a subject I will get into in just a few. But back to the Army on December 7th. In preparation for an attack that of course would never come, the Army decided to park their aircraft in nice, tight, neat rows on the interior of the tarmacs, not dispersed widely across the area as before. In neat rows, the aircraft would be more difficult to sabotage, or so was thought, as they'd be able to be watched closer. That being said, in nice neat rows, they would also be easier to destroy from the air, as would be shown on the morning of December 7th. There was little to no concern from an aerial attack on Hickam or Wheeler Fields. And that morning being, of course, December 7th, the normally busy airfields and hangars were unusually quiet. Virtually no activity at all. The only activity was in the control tower for Hickam, where officers were gathered awaiting a flight of B-17s that were to come in from the mainland. But aside from that, it was quiet and serene. The same could be said at Schofield Barracks, the setting of From Here to Eternity. The headquarters of the 24th and 25th Infantry Divisions were both quiet offices that morning. Most of the men were either on pass in Honolulu or asleep in their barracks. The quiet wouldn't last long, however. In the minutes after the attack started, most soldiers who got outside to see what the noise was all about stared at the harbor and wondered what in the hell was actually going on. Japanese aircraft pulling out of their dives over Ford Island buzzed close to Hickam as the first wave of VALs, those are the Japanese dive bombers, dove in on the bombers and fighters packed in neat rows as I spoke about just a minute ago. Any confusion as to what exactly was going on vanished when the aircraft, initially thought to be Marines, started strafing the men on the tarmac and dropping bombs on the hangars. The first explosion on a maintenance hangar sent men scattering for cover. Men ran and hollered warnings to other soldiers inside the large barracks building at Hickam. Many of the men inside were lining up for morning chow when a Japanese bomb crashed through the roof, exploding amidst the men, killing 35 in an instant. Over at Schofield, several miles away from Pearl Harbor, the men were lining up for morning chow in the quadrangle when the first VALs flew over. Corporal Maurice Herman ran to the air raid siren and began cranking it as fast as he could. Initially, the soldiers were confused as to what was going on. Men were reluctant to leave the chow line, lose their place in line, even though the air raid siren was wailing, so they stood there and looked up at the sky. Their indecision was erased when a Japanese aircraft again came in and strafed the line of men, sending the would-be chow hounds scattering for cover. One of the men who was in Schofield that morning was a young baker named Nolan Albarado. Nolan was a Louisiana native and had been stationed at Schofield for a little under a year. He was in the mess hall cooking when the attack started. Like many of his comrades, he had no clue as to what was happening when the Japanese air raid began. Distant explosions were thought to be the Navy practicing attacking the harbor. Anti-aircraft bursts were again thought to be the Navy practicing. The aircraft diving overhead were thought to be Marines until the first bomb exploded not far from Albarado, and he watched his comrades run for cover to escape the Japanese machine gun fire. Once the attackers were identified, the soldiers ran to get weapons to fire back. Let's hear what Mr. Albarado has to say about that confused and frightening morning.
And when the alarm, everybody ran out. We didn't have no ammunition, so we ran out and I went in them trenches, you know. So that was early. Then about close to 12 o'clock again, another alarm came, and that time they said that after we come back, everybody was saying that they had dropped paratroopers in the graveyard. So I noticed that I was by myself in the trenches over there. I said, well, where's the graveyard? I didn't know it was the graveyard. I didn't know what them trenches were for even at that time. I said, well, don't worry about the paratroopers. If they were there, we were just as scared as I was, because I was in them trenches over there. And then after that, when you come back, they said they had a smell of gas, so they started getting gas masks out. And they all in tin containers, you know. And they didn't have nothing to open it. They were using bayonet to open the cans and all. Some of them got cut in their hand cut with that tin, tried to get the gas mask out.
Nolan wasn't the only man trying to do his job amidst all the confusion and chaos. Another soldier, whom we heard from earlier, Herbert Weatherwax, was on his way to Schofield from his house in Honolulu when the attack started. Herbert was an Oahu native that had enlisted in the Army the year before. Being stationed at Schofield Barracks on his native Oahu was a nice posting for the young Hawaiian, a job he enjoyed and looked forward to each morning. This morning, however, was different. Let's listen to what Herbert has to say about December 7th.
I lived in Honolulu, and early that morning, Sunday morning, which was a beautiful morning, I heard a loud explosion in the direction of Pearl Harbor. And I turned the radio on to find out what it was about. And they announced that all military personnel report to your station immediately. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. And I did. So I got a ride to get back to Schofield, which was in the opposite side of Pearl Harbor. And I passed by Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden I looked out and I saw the Arizona just engulfed in flames. That whole ship was just wrapped up in flame. And that explosion was a loud explosion. And then I look out in the ocean, I saw a battleship that had been torpedoed, and it flipped over on the side, and just the hull of the ship was above water. And I could see little dark objects scrambling on the hull of the ship. And the water was on fire, the other battleships were ablaze, and that whole area is just black with smoke. I don't recall seeing any airplanes flying at that time, but my bus had to keep going all the time. So, and as we advanced, before we got to Schofield, we passed by the airfield, Wheelerfield. Wheelerfield was where all our fighter planes were assembled out there, and they had been parked out on the runway. And that runway was all that airplanes was just destroyed right in place. The air hangars were ablaze, were burning. And I looked out and I could see one plane circling around in that area there. But then this is my observation at that instant. And then I got into Schofield, got into my uniform. We had to wait there for a short while to get all our troops assembled. And then we got into our convoy. Now that was on one portion of the island. It was on a northern section. Now we had to get in a convoy and get all around the island and along the coast and go to where my unit was assembled there. And that was assembled on the windward side. And the town there was Kailua and Kaneohe. And we had a large naval air station in that bay there. They call it Kaneohe Bay. And when we got inside of that station there, I could see it burning too.
Confusion and chaos were the orders of the day following the attack on Oahu. As is seen in the movie, the 25th ID stationed some of their infantry along the beaches, closer inland actually in reality, and in the hills above Honolulu. The fear inside most on the island in those days following the attack was of a Japanese airborne landing, and of course a follow-up aerial strike, neither of which ever happened. Paranoia over anything and everybody of Japanese descent was very real, not only on the mainland, but also in Hawaii for obvious reasons. Every Japanese was now thought to be a spy and a killer just waiting to spring on an unsuspecting serviceman or Hawaiian native. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. We'll be taking a break for a couple of weeks as we prepare more discussions for the upcoming season. We'll return the first week of December to discuss the most accurate World War II movie of all time, one I know that all of our loyal listeners have been dying to hear us discuss, the historical merits of Pearl Harbor. That one should be fun. Until then, be sure to scroll through our archive and catch up on the episodes you may have missed. Do us a favor and drop us a review on iTunes and Stitcher if you like what you've heard from us so far. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.